Thank you, Dr. Gill. Thanks to Dr. Pinson and Gill, and of course the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. I was assigned to talk about which patients are quote unquote too early to receive a transplantation, those with HCC. In other words, who shouldn't get such high priority for transplant at this time? And the first thing is there actually a problem? And I would argue that there is, because of course in the United States and other places, there's not enough livers to go around for all the people that need a liver transplant. And HCC right now is the fastest growing indication for liver transplantation in the United States for multiple reasons. We have an aging population, the incidence of HCC is going up, and despite the new HCV agents, which may eradicate HCV in the future, we still are feeling the effects of HCV-induced cirrhosis. And the growing epidemic of NASH-NAFLD will continue to probably supply us with a robust stable of patients that require transplantation. And HCC now accounts for at least or nearly 25% of liver transplantation in the United States. This is clearly growing. It's quite a bit more compared to the less than 5% of patients that were transplanted for HCC before the institution of the MELD score for allocation in 2002. Between 2002 and 2008, the HCC population comprised of 10 to 15% of liver transplants that were performed. And so as we increase the proportion and number and prevalence of HCC patients that require liver transplantation, we should clearly try to maximize the transplant benefit for HCC candidates. And so that means mostly maximizing post-transplant survival, but also triaging the more urgent candidates first. So how should we think about liver transplantation for HCC? Well, we want to hit that sweet spot for liver transplantation and transplant those, again, who benefit the most. Or, put it another way, we don't want to transplant those patients who don't need a transplant right now, that don't need it yet, or those that can wait, or what might consider too early. We also don't want to transplant patients who clearly will do poorly after transplant, that have a high risk of recurrence or death, have a poor prognosis, and therefore are quote-unquote too late. So what about priority for HCC patients? It's undergone a lot of evolution in the United States, in UNOS, and right now we don't give any exception points for T1 lesions, that is a single lesion less than 2 centimeters, given multiple findings, including that it was found that over a third of patients with arterial enhancing lesions less than 2 centimeters had no tumor and explant pathology, and that patients with T1 lesions that were listed had a very low risk of dropout. So since 2004, patients meeting 2T criteria, that is single lesion 2 to 5 or 2 to 3 lesions, all less than 3 centimeters, automatically get HCC exception points, all of these people given the same level of priority. So who do we not want to transplant that we sometimes still do? We obviously don't want to transplant patients that actually don't have HCC. We do these transplants sometimes. I'll give you the evidence that we do. And we also, obviously, those patients with extrahepatic metastatic HCCs, and unknowingly we probably do this sometimes as well with micrometastatic disease that we can't pick up on imaging. So in the past, we have clearly over-prioritized the HCC patients over the patients without HCC. And we saw that because those patients enjoyed a much lower dropout rate, much lower waitlist mortality, and got transplanted quicker compared to the patients without HCC. And so the HCC exception policy has been modified several times by our committee, the UNOS Liver Committee, several times since the introduction of MELD. The goal was to try to equalize a little bit the drop-off rates of the waitlist removal or death between the non-HCC patients and the HCC patients. So we've done several things. Over several iterations, we've dropped the number of points granted to the HCC patients, and again, we've done that several times. We also recently instituted a 6-month delay in granting any HCC MELD exception points to the HCC patients placed on the wait list. And this does two things. It prevents patients from being transplanted immediately for HCC and actually allows both a biological test of time and assessment of other things, including a response to treatment. So how often do we actually transplant patients with a diagnosis of HCC and we are wrong about it? It doesn't happen all that often, but it clearly does. And in an analysis that we performed of the UNOS database and the explant pathology, which is now being required to be submitted from all transplant centers, we looked at how often there was an HCC misdiagnosis. And so the analysis was done for all patients that were done for T2 HCCs between April 2012 and 2015. So in this period of time, there were 5,600 patients listed with a MELD exception points for HCC, and we looked at only the patients that were always within Milan criteria. None of the patients were above Milan criteria and then downstage. We looked at all those patients that underwent a liver transplant with an explant pathology form that was completed. And of these patients, the big majority, 94%, had already received local regional therapy before having their liver transplant. So in these patients, when a pathology couldn't find HCC on explant, we thought that, well, that may have been just because of a complete response to HCC. But of all these patients, 324 had no previous history of any local regional therapy prior to transplantation. And interestingly, 11% of them had absolutely no HCC found on explant. So something like 11% of the patients that were transplanted with an HCC exception that had never undergone local regional therapy had no HCC on explant. And this is just a schematic of the folks that we studied. There was 6,200 patients that underwent liver transplant with HCC. A subset were always within Milan. This is a subset that we studied without any local regional therapy prior to liver transplant. And again, 89% of those patients did have some evidence of HCC on explant, but 35 or 11% of them had no HCC on explant. So, do we transplant patients with a misdiagnosis of HCC? Yes, but not that often. What about our current UNOS policy? The current UNOS policy groups together and lumps together a lot of patients together. In other words, all HCC patients meeting 2.2 criteria are granted the same level of exception points. And I would argue that this includes a very heterogeneous group of patients, some with a relatively high risk for dropout. And should we give some of these patients higher priority? I would say yes, maybe to a limit, but this has a risk of increasing post-transplant HCC recurrence. Those patients that are at the highest risk for dropout are also probably at the highest risk of recurrence. But what about those patients that are at very low risk for dropout? I would suggest that we give them less priority, or even no priority until they show evidence of recurrence. So what is the data? What's the evidence that some patients can wait longer and don't need as much priority as some of the other T2 patients? So the hypothesis when we looked at our experience is that patients with a T2 tumor represents a heterogeneous group that includes patients with a relatively low risk of progression with other patients, and we could identify those patients at the outset. So we evaluated about 400 patients with T2 lesions to determine the risk factors for waitlist dropout. And we found that those that are at highest risk for dropout are those with a larger lesion that is greater than 3 centimeters, up to 5, those with more than 1 lesion, and those that exhibited a lack of a complete response to their first local regional therapy, and those that had persistently high AFP level after their first local regional therapy. In converse, we actually found a subgroup with very low dropout rates, and this represented a decent proportion of the HCC patients listed and transplanted. Again, 20% of the patients with a T2 HCC fit under these criteria. And what are those criteria? Those criteria are those patients that had a single tumor between 2 and 3 centimeters and demonstrated a complete response to local regional therapy on imaging and had a low AFP, less than 20, after their first local regional therapy. This subgroup demonstrated 1-year and 2-year dropout rates off the waitlist of 1.3 and 1.6% respectively. This compared to the rest of the whole HCC group that demonstrated 21.6% and 26.5% 1- and 2-year dropout rates, p-level quite significant. So if we were not to give these patients exception points, how would they fare? Well, because we have such a long waiting time in our region, we could see what their drop-off rates would be over time. And this is a low dropout risk group. Again, they have an extremely low dropout rate if you've met all the criteria, and this is the rest of the T2 patients. Now, one of the criticisms of this paper when we published it was that, is this just specific to Region 5, or is this generalizable outside our region because this was a single center study? So the study that I mentioned just now was possible because of the long waiting times for HCC in our region. So we expanded this analysis to the United States using UNOS data in the long wait regions where we could actually perform this study. So we looked at Region 1 in New England, Region 5 in the West Coast, and Region 9 in New York to identify a similar low-risk group in the national database. So at this point, we looked at 2,000 candidates listed with HCC exceptions with T2 lesions, and the entire, for this entire cohort, with T2 lesions and got HCC exception points, the dropout risk for the entire cohort was 18.3% dropout at 1 year and 27% dropout at 2 years. So what were the results? We were able to also identify another low-risk group. Again, slightly different. We found that anyone with a single lesion between 2 and 3 centimeters and had a low AFP and Child's Class A and a MELD sodium less than 15, those patients had a much lower dropout rate than the rest of the cohort. 245 patients in the entire cohort met these criteria. That's approximately 12% of the patients that received liver transplants with a T2 lesion. And the dropout rate for this group, the low-risk group, was 5.5% compared to 20% for the rest of the cohort. Unfortunately, we couldn't analyze the response to treatment as a variable, which we found as a variable in our single-center study, because this is not actually captured reliably in the UNOS database. I suspect that if we were to have that, that response to treatment would probably fall out as a variable that would predict for low risk. So in summary, using both a large single-center experience and the national data, it's been possible to identify a subgroup of patients with a T2 HCC that have a much lower risk of dropout from the waiting list. Again, the single-center study showed that it was a single lesion, 2 to 3 centimeters, that exhibited a complete response after the first local regional therapy based on imaging and an AFP less than 20. And similarly, using the UNOS data, much larger group found that a single lesion, low AFP, Child's A, and lab MELD sodium less than 15 also had a very low dropout rate. So my work in organ allocation makes me realize that this is not actually the committee, the deck chair rearranging working group, and not just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, because what we want to do is actually triage. And so it's basically figuring out who on the Titanic needs a lifeboat first. In other words, let's rescue the people that need rescuing first. And we've done that to a certain extent with the chronic liver patients. So the most urgent patients, status 1A, MELD greater than 35, they have the highest priority. The next most urgent ones are the lowest MELD, but it's really unclear where the HCC patients should really fit within this algorithm. We all obviously want to, again, in the sweet spot, want to transplant patients that are likely to progress and really, quote unquote, need a liver transplant. But then, again, you want to put a cap on that a little bit, less likely to die of early recurrence. And then obviously get patients transplanted less urgently with diseases that won't progress or have such a high mortality. So are there patients we are rescuing too early? My answer would be yes. The result of this is that we could be saving other lives who need the liver transplants more urgently. The patients we identified with low risk can tread water for longer, and we need to divert our lifeboats to those who are drowning more quickly. Now, we don't want to actually try to save the patients that are already dead or likely to die, but we have safeguards against that. We don't want to do more futile transplants, but in the United States, we are held to our publicly reported results by the SRTR and the specific reports, the program-specific reports. Also, UNOS looks at our data, as well as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. So there's a lot of federal regulation and oversight that won't allow us to perform more and more futile transplants if it reflects our patient survival and graft survival. So what are the possible changes that I would propose to current allocation policy? One, I would certainly try to require an attempt at local regional therapy or justify or explain why a candidate can't have local regional therapy before any exception points are granted. Two, I would lower priority to certain HCC candidates that we have identified with a very low risk of dropout. We've identified some of these potential HCC populations, and other authors have also suggested lowering priority of patients that demonstrate a complete response to non-transplant treatments, whether they be Y90 or TACE or RFA microwave, until or unless they recur. We currently do that with patients that we resect. So patients who are resected in the United States don't get priority until they recur. I would argue that we should do the same with local regional therapy. And finally, as we evolve in our HCC scoring systems and risk stratifications, looking at molecular markers, et cetera, if biopsy ever becomes a standard, we could perhaps include degree of differentiation, other molecular markers to identify those that are very low risk for progressing and for dropping out. In the meanwhile, though, it looks like the alpha-fetoprotein and the response to local regional therapy and the true biological test of time, as long as it's limited to a certain number of months to less than a year, the response to therapy remains a powerful predictor of whether one's going to progress without transplant or not. So thank you very much. I would argue that we are transplanting some folks a little too early, and that we can fix that relatively quickly, changing our allocation system. Thank you very much.